Have you ever caught yourself smiling in a room where you felt completely out of place, laughing at a joke that didn't land, or saying yes to something your whole being wanted to say no to? It's almost as if something inside overrides your instinct and makes you perform for a silent audience. This unseen force, this compulsion to conform, is not just a glitch in your character. It's a pattern wired deep within us. Since childhood, you've been learning an invisible language, one that speaks in praise and punishment, in approval and avoidance. You learned early that being liked meant being safe, and from that moment on, you began tailoring your behavior to fit the mold others crafted for you. But here's the quiet tragedy of it all. You weren't just learning to behave, you were learning to betray yourself. The approval you were taught to seek didn't come free. It came with conditions, with a trade. Be accepted, but not as you are, only as you're expected to be. So you put on a mask, maybe several. You created personas for each room, each relationship, each situation, not because you were manipulative, but because you were terrified. Terrified of being rejected, of being left alone with your true self, the self you began to forget even existed. Carl Jung saw this with painful clarity. He warned us that the greatest danger wasn't in wearing a mask, it was in forgetting we were wearing one. When the persona becomes indistinguishable from identity, you don't just act out a role. You believe the role is you. You live for applause, not for truth. And what's worse, you begin to shrink. The parts of you that don't fit the script get exiled to the shadows. Your desires, your anger, your rawness, even your brilliance, they're pushed down because they threaten the character you've built. But the more you suppress, the louder those hidden parts scream. They sabotage your peace, not because they want chaos, but because they want to be seen. Think about that for a second. What would happen if you stopped performing? If you dared to show up, not as the curated version of yourself, but as the whole, messy, complex being you truly are? It would be uncomfortable, yes. You'd disappoint people. You'd lose some admiration, perhaps even some relationships. But in return, you'd gain something far more valuable, yourself. And isn't that the point? To live a life that feels real, not just looks good from the outside? But let's not romanticize this process. Individuation, as Jung called it, isn't some poetic awakening. It's a demolition. It's tearing down years, maybe decades, of internalized scripts and expectations. It's standing naked in front of your own psyche and saying, "This is me," even when parts of you are trembling. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it's admitting that much of what you thought was you was actually a survival strategy. And here's where it gets even more nuanced. Your psychological type, the way your mind naturally operates, shapes the way you seek approval. If you're someone led by extroverted feeling, your entire sense of identity might be tied to how others perceive you. If they're happy, you're okay. If they disapprove, your world crumbles. That's not weakness, that's wiring. But wiring can be understood, and once understood, it can be rewired. Others, more introverted or analytical, may not fear disapproval directly, but they fear being misunderstood, dismissed, invalidated. So they silence themselves preemptively, censor their thoughts before they even leave the mind. Either way, the effect is the same. A life lived half-lit, never fully illuminated by your true presence. So what do? You start by noticing. You begin catching those moments where you shrink yourself, where you bend your voice, where you betray a gut instinct in favor of being palatable. And you pause. You breathe. You ask yourself, is this really me? Or is this the persona? And sometimes you'll choose to speak your truth anyway, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Because each honest moment is a step away from the cage and a step toward freedom. And make no mistake, freedom is not just about doing whatever you want. It's about being whoever you are, regardless of who's watching. That kind of freedom scares people. It challenges the status quo. It threatens the systems that run on conformity. But it also liberates. Not just you, but those around you who are waiting, aching, hoping to see someone else go first. The moment you stop living for approval, you stop living in fear. And fear, more than anything, is what keeps you small. The fear of rejection, the fear of judgment, the fear of being unlovable. These fears are not irrational. They were taught to you, but they're not the truth. The truth is, you were never meant to be universally liked. You were meant to be real. And realness comes with edges, with shadows, with contradictions. Speaking of shadows, Jung's concept of the shadow is perhaps the most liberating and terrifying of all. It's the container for everything you've disowned, everything you were told not to be. But the shadow is not the enemy. It's the guardian of your power. Integrating it doesn't mean letting it run wild. It means bringing it into the light, understanding it, owning it. When you do that, you become whole. And wholeness is what finally sets you free from the tyranny of approval. Because when you've seen your own darkness and chosen to love yourself anyway, no one else's opinion can unmake you. Their rejection no longer feels like a death sentence. Their praise no longer feels like a lifeline. You become anchored, not in applause, not in image, but in essence. And that's where the real journey begins. Imagine walking into a room full of people who've known you for years, but you've only ever shown them a version of yourself that fits their expectations. You carry jokes you don't laugh at anymore, opinions you've outgrown, and a smile that sometimes feels more like armor than expression. Every interaction becomes a calculation. What should I say to keep the peace? How should I respond to be liked? But somewhere beneath the performance, something within you begins to ache. It's not loud, not urgent, but persistent, like a whisper reminding you that you're not living your life, you're managing it. This is the pain of disconnection, not from others, but from your own soul. And that pain grows louder the longer you pretend. You start to feel it in quiet moments, in the silence after the laughter fades, in the loneliness that creeps in, even when the room is full. You begin to question, what would it feel like to be seen? Not for who I'm trying to be, but for who I actually am. But here's the challenge. To be seen, truly seen, means risking rejection not of a mask, but of your bare self. And that risk feels unbearable until you start to understand something crucial. Rejection is not the worst thing that can happen. Self-abandonment is. Because each time you betray yourself to gain approval, you lose a little more of the person you were born to become. Carl Jung's idea of individuation wasn't just a psychological theory. It was a call to arms, a path back to your authentic self. But that path doesn't start with light. It starts in the shadow. You see, your shadow is not just a collection of negative traits. It's also the graveyard of your potential. Your passion, your spontaneity, your wildness, buried not because they were bad, but because they were inconvenient. And until you reclaim them, you walk through life incomplete. The shadow doesn't go away because you ignore it. It waits, and the more you suppress it, the more power it has to leak out in ways you can't control. You snap in anger at a friend. You crumble under pressure. You sabotage relationships, not because you're weak, but because a part of you is tired of being silenced. Integration is the process of bringing those hidden parts into the light, with compassion, not condemnation. Think of someone who once told you to calm down when you were passionate, or to be realistic when you were dreaming, or to behave when your spirit was trying to dance. Those voices became internalized. They became the scripts you now run in your own mind. You criticize yourself before anyone else has the chance. You shrink before anyone asks you to. But those voices are not truth. They are echoes. And the moment you recognize that, you can begin to write new scripts. Real change doesn't start with pretending to be fearless. It starts with facing your fear and walking forward anyway. It's standing in a room and saying something honest even if your voice trembles. It's setting a boundary even when it makes others uncomfortable. It's choosing solitude over company that asks you to be less than you are. This is the raw, often lonely, but deeply liberating path to selfhood. Jung didn't just speak of these ideas, he lived them. His break from Freud wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply personal. He was leaving behind a mentor, a movement, a safety net. He was choosing the unknown over the familiar, not because it was easier, but because it was true. That choice nearly broke him. He went through years of psychological crisis, journaling visions and symbols that no one understood at the time. But through that darkness, he found his light, and that light became a beacon for millions. What does that mean for you? It means that the path to yourself may require a similar descent. You may need to let go of roles you've played for years. You may need to walk away from relationships that thrive on your inauthenticity. You may even need to redefine your entire understanding of success, of happiness, of love. This is not a loss. It's a shedding, a return. And as you walk that path, something unexpected begins to happen. You become more grounded, more peaceful. Not because life gets easier, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. You stop chasing applause and start following resonance. You begin to speak in your real voice. And slowly, the people who resonate with that voice begin to find you. Not everyone will. Some will leave, some will resist, but those who stay will see you. And that, more than anything, is what we crave. Not approval, but recognition. But recognition begins within. It begins when you look in the mirror and say, I know who I am, and I will no longer abandon that person to fit into places I've outgrown. This is not arrogance, it's integrity. And in a world that thrives on superficial connection, integrity is revolutionary. The journey isn't about becoming something more. It's about becoming less of what you're not. Less of the performer, less of the pleaser, less of the curated character. And as you peel away those layers, what's left is not weakness, but strength. The kind that can't be shaken by disapproval or inflated by praise. The kind that simply is. You begin to live with a new compass, one that doesn't point toward popularity, but toward peace. You stop asking, what will they think? And start asking, does this align with who I really am? And every time you choose the latter, you reclaim a piece of your soul. Piece by piece you return. And in that return, you find something profound. Not just authenticity, but wholeness. Not just confidence, but clarity. And a life that no longer needs to be explained or defended, just lived. There comes a moment when you no longer want to keep performing, not because you're exhausted, though you are, but because you finally understand that the role you've been playing is not worth the cost. You begin to feel the distance between your inner world and the outer performance, and that gap grows heavier, more painful, impossible to ignore. You start to see that living for approval is a form of quiet suffering. It doesn't scream, it doesn't scar the surface, it just erodes you slowly from the inside. But something within refuses to be silenced anymore. It might show up as restlessness, as anger, as sadness you can't quite name, and that's how the soul speaks. Through discomfort, through unease, through the aching sense that this can't be all there is. Not this filtered life, not this constant pretending. You want depth, you want honesty, you want to feel alive again. And that only happens when you start living as yourself, not as the idea you think others prefer. Freedom begins in small, radical acts, saying what you actually think, admitting what you truly feel, walking away from what no longer serves your growth, choosing presence over performance. And slowly, the script you've memorized begins to fade. You stop managing perceptions and start telling the truth. not because it guarantees approval, but because it's the only thing that sets you free. This is the essence of Jung's vision. Wholeness over perfection. Not becoming a flawless version of yourself, but becoming complete, complex, real. Wholeness means embracing the full range of who you are. Your passion, your vulnerability, your uncertainty, your strength. It means making room for the parts of you that were once labeled too much or not enough. And in doing so, you realize that your power was never in being liked. It was in being honest. You will still feel fear. That's inevitable. But now, the fear no longer controls you. It becomes a signal, not a stop sign. Every time you step into your truth, despite the trembling, you reclaim another inch of your life, and that life begins to feel deeply, profoundly yours. You start to recognize how the need for approval shows up in your everyday choices. You hear it in the silence after you hold back your opinion. You feel it in the discomfort after you laugh at something that didn't feel right. But instead of judging yourself, you begin to understand. You see these moments not as failures, but as invitations to go deeper, to realign, to choose differently next time. And each time you choose truth over performance, the ground beneath you becomes more solid. You're no longer chasing validation like a mirage. You're building something real, a foundation rooted in your values, your vision, your voice. And from that place, you can finally breathe, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You'll find that some people no longer understand you, no longer fit into the new spaces you're creating. That's okay. Their departure is not a rejection. It's a clearing. It's making space for relationships built on resonance, not convenience. And those relationships, the ones where you can show up without editing, are the ones that nourish your soul. Living authentically does not mean you will never feel uncertain or exposed. In fact, it guarantees you will. But you'll also feel something else, peace. A peace that comes not from being perfect, but from being whole. You begin to see yourself not as a product of approval, but as a person with depth, with shadow and light, with contradictions that no longer need to be hidden. You become the kind of person who can stand in a storm and still say, "This is who I am," not out of defiance, but out of clarity, out of love. Because when you no longer abandon yourself to be accepted, you finally understand what it means to belong. You belong to yourself first, and from there, everything changes. You begin to create, to love, to speak, not from a place of performance, but from presence. Your art becomes bolder. Your relationships become deeper. Your life becomes a reflection of your soul, not a response to someone else's script. And that's when the shift happens. You stop fearing rejection because you've stopped rejecting yourself. You stop craving applause because you've stopped performing. You begin to live fully, truly, finally. So now the only question left is not whether you are ready to be approved of, but whether you are ready to be alive. Not in fragments, not in roles, not behind a mask, but as your full, unfiltered, beautiful self. Because the life you want isn't out there, waiting for someone to give you permission. It's within you, waiting for you to choose it. Choose it now. Choose it every day, and never stop.